Hello, welcome back to Am I Neurodivergent? In last week's video, I nailed my wildly optimistic neurodivergent postcard from the future to the mast about the destination I'd like to see us all get to in 25 years' time in terms of a society fully understanding and embracing of neurodivergence instead of broadly pushing it to one side and ignoring it. A significant part of getting to that destination is going to be around increasing the general levels of education, knowledge, and understanding about autism and other neurodivergent conditions. With that in mind, Chapter 21, Week 21, recapping my discovery year, was teaching myself as much about autism as I could to try to understand the new me better after getting my late ASD diagnosis. By far, the best autism online educational resource I found at this stage of my journey was a month-long online course called Understanding Autism, run by the University of Kent and available free of charge through the FutureLearn website. I'll put a link to that course in the description of this video. This video, and possibly the next couple of videos in this series, are going to basically be me regurgitating a lot of the information I learned and absorbed during this period of my journey from the notes I made at the time, but huge caveat that my musings on the course are by no means a substitute for the fantastic modules available on the Understanding Autism course proper. I'm not an autism expert, just a late diagnosed individual trying to get to grips with it all, and would strongly urge anyone looking to understand autism to sign up to the course and take these modules. The course was put together by Jill Bradshaw, Georgina Watts, and Dr. Damien Milton, who's been key in developing the double empathy theory of autism, which we'll get to later in this video. Both George and Dr. Milton are themselves autistic and are just fantastic voices to listen to. Autistic education from autistic people with autistic perspectives. Shocking concept, right? Right, I'm just going to batter through some of the notes I took from week one of the course this week and some stuff that I've bulleted and highlighted, a mixture of either verbatim quotes from the course or my own musings on them. Some of this week's content may feel like it repeats things I've done earlier in this video series, but I'm treating this week almost like a midpoint reset in my video series to just make sure all the basics have been 100% captured and to fill in some basic gaps that I might have glossed over and missed. So, some basic things to start covered in week one of the course, Autism 101 essentially, starting from scratch. Right. Current estimates are that around 1 in 100 people are autistic. Autistic people fundamentally experience the world differently to non-autistic people, particularly around differences in communication and sensory experiences. While autism can present itself very differently in different people and can often lead to significant strengths, the experience of these differences also often significantly disadvantages autistic people as we try to navigate our way through a non-autistic world. The medical definition of autism is someone with persistent difficulties with social communication and interaction and with restricted repetitive patterns of behaviours, activities and interests to the extent they limit and impair everyday functions. End quote. I love the fact in the course that they immediately go to George, who acknowledges that a medical definition is helpful to the extent it enables access to diagnosis and support, but that is not a definition she, as an autistic person, would herself use to describe autistic people, whom she would always describe in terms of differences rather than deficits. Autistic people simply have a different way of being and a different way of experiencing the world to non-autistic people. It's non-autistic people who describe these autistic differences as deficits when looked at through the lens of navigating a non-autistic world. And from that moment, I loved the course immediately from the start. I was still in the early stages of rediscovering my self-identity after getting a late diagnosis, and so much of the stuff you still read on the internet about autism is from the medical model perspective. So I absolutely loved that an academic institution was calling BS on those existing tropes immediately and saying it's actually a bit more nuanced and layered than how it's traditionally been presented, and that our understanding of autism and neurodivergence is constantly evolving as we grow to understand it more. What we thought we knew about autism 10 years ago is now significantly out of date, and what we think we know now about autism will likely become significantly out of date in the next 10 years. And a big reason for that is actually involving autistic voices in autistic research and listening to those voices rather than making assumptions. George makes a great point that if you're wanting to learn about experiencing menstrual cycles, you'd talk to people who have periods. Anything else would be ridiculous. And the same must and is starting to apply to autism. So, some facts. Autistic people have always existed. It's just a different brain wiring. This is not a new phenomenon, we just recognise it better now. It's a fact that autism is still identified in men more than women, primarily because women are better at masking autistic traits than men, which we'll cover more of in a bit. Not that there are more than of one than the other. Autism is a lifelong condition you're born with. You grow into it, not out of it. Autism is not yet identifiable through blood tests or brain scans, but it's evidenced through experience and through patterns of behaviour which are present from childhood. Autism is rarely the only condition you have. It more often than not co-presents alongside other conditions such as anxiety, ADHD or intellectual disabilities. Hence the wildly different profiles you'll find in autistic people across the spectrum. Autistic people tend to be visual rather than verbal learners, which can cause communication difficulties for autistic people in schools and workplaces. Autistic people have a tendency to obsessively focus on details. Autistic people find predictability and structure in their lives hugely helpful. Because of differences in information processing, autistic people can often struggle to communicate what they're thinking and feeling. Some false facts also, although some do, not all autistic people have quote-unquote special skills that set them apart as exceptional in some way. The vast majority of us are just regular people with different brain wiring trying to get by in a world filled with people who think and act differently to us. We still don't know why 1% of the population are autistic, just that they are. A huge thing for me that was flagged early in the course is how wrong it is to think of the term autism spectrum as a straight line spectrum ranging from not autistic to a little bit autistic to very autistic. That's a really outdated way of thinking about autism that leads to people traditionally seen as a little bit autistic getting completely overwhelmed and burnt out because the impression is you don't struggle that much, and if you do, you're just being lazy and overdramatic. And conversely, if you were traditionally seen as on the high end of that linear spectrum and had higher support needs, your strengths and abilities were traditionally downplayed and people had lower expectations of you when you were actually capable of so much more. There's a great comic strip explainer on this that I'll pop a link to in the video description as well alongside the course link. Instead, we should think of the autism spectrum as a colour wheel, a colour spectrum where some areas of an autistic person's brain are virtually identical to non-autistic people's brains, for example in language, motor skills, perception, executive function or sensory, but significantly different in others. Most neurotypical people tend to be pretty consistent in their behaviours and abilities, but neurodivergent people can have what are known as spiky profiles within the spectrum colour wheel. So very strong compared to average in some areas and very weak compared to average in other areas. And those specific strengths and weaknesses vary from autistic person to autistic person, which is again why autistic presentations can vary so much. Autistic is a hugely diverse label because it covers a hugely diverse range of presentations, and that is often exceptionally confusing for non-autistic people to understand. Regardless of IQ or verbal ability or support needs, the three observable challenges consistent with all autistic people tend to be communication, social interactions, and patterns of behaviour. But observing these is itself a significant challenge because undiagnosed autistic people, often from a very young age, learn to act in ways that are not considered autistic. This does not, however, mean they're not autistic or have grown out of their autism. They still think and experience the world differently. It just means they've learned to mask or disguise or camouflage their autism, often at great personal expense to their well-being. Telltale signs of autism in undiagnosed people can be a tendency to interpret information literally, a strong eye for detail, preferring concrete things and facts to vague ideas, carefully following rules, and preferring facts over feelings. Autistic hearing, taste, and touch is often experienced wildly differently to non-autistic people, and a comforting noise or texture to some can sometimes be incredibly distressing to people on the spectrum. Another thing in the course I loved was George saying autistic people are like cakes, and cakes can be very different from each other. They all have certain key ingredients that are essential for all cakes, but a Battenberg is very different from a Victoria sponge. And other conditions like ADHD are like biscuits, and if you have both, you can be something in between a cake and a biscuit, like a Jaffa cake. A few weeks after taking this course, I discovered that I was in fact a Jaffa cake. She also notes that when some people say everyone's a little bit autistic because they have like one autistic trait they recognize in themselves, the example she uses is an omelette isn't a little bit cake just because it also has eggs. You either have autistic traits or you don't have autistic traits. Dr. Damien Milton, one of the UK's foremost academics in the field, talks about his own late diagnosis following his son's diagnosis. His son also has co-occurring learning disabilities. Reading up and learning about autism and realizing he himself was on the autism spectrum, he talks about how it's only relatively recently that more verbally articulate people without co-occurring learning disabilities have become recognized as also being on the spectrum. The subcategory formerly known as Asperger's syndrome, but now all under the one umbrella term of autism spectrum condition, while we get a better understanding of all the different facets and presentations of autism. The course looks in more depth at interpreting and processing information, and there were a lot of things that were clicking in place for me going through these modules. That autistic people tend to prefer written communication to verbal communication because there's less ambiguity and things being left open to interpretation. I've always preferred an email or text message to a phone call, which I can find quite stressful. So all of this was tracking for me. Stuff that over the years I felt were dozens of different quirks I had were now clearly just manifestations of the one quirk, so to speak, which was incredibly liberating to realise. The course looked at how non-autistic people seem to be intuitively hardwired to be social, but autistic people have to learn and mimic social skills, and that can, particularly over time, be absolutely exhausting. All children mimic behaviour and communication in the early years, but for non-autistic kids it becomes second nature, while for autistic kids we always keep mimicking and it never becomes second nature. And this is because we don't form the cognitive shortcuts, and this gets really interesting with both advantages and disadvantages of that different brain wiring. It's also where we tend to see autistic girls and women whose childhood and adolescent social groups stereotypically place higher values on empathy and social relationships get way better at masking and mimicking behaviours than their male counterparts, which at least goes in part to showing why autistic girls and women get missed so much more than autistic boys. Some boy dogs excessively mask too. I think I've mentioned in the past that one of my early therapists nodded sympathetically and said, "You masked much more like a girl than a boy from a very early age," like white male, cisgender, speaking for the ladies too. I joke there are exceptionally good female YouTubers out there, given their perspectives and experiences, and anyone watching these should definitely go and watch them. They put out way better content than I do. And some of the channels I've been enjoying learning the female perspective from recently that you should check out, and I'll put proper links to these in the video descriptions too, are Neurodivergent, Trying to Unmask, although that channel looks to have been deleted, which is a massive shame. Gemma's Journey, and some of the bigger female-led channels that I've found super useful, like Foster on the Spectrum, Purple Ella, and Yosamdi Sam. All of these channels by women on the spectrum are awesome in different ways and helping to shift that false narrative that autism is predominantly a male condition, and you should 100% go and check all of them out. Either search for them or I'll put the descriptions, the links in the descriptions. Anyway, of course, another long-standing myth about autism that sadly still widely believed that the course really challenges is what's known as theory of mind, which is basically the belief that autistic people fundamentally lack an understanding of or empathy towards the thoughts and feelings of others. This theory has been hugely damaging to autistic people over the years, but a more recent interpretation / nuancing of it has become known as mind blindness, kind of similar to time blindness with ADHD. The term mind blindness puts more emphasis on autistic people sometimes being unaware of the more ambiguous social information being used to communicate other people's perspectives, rather than being indifferent or unempathetic towards those perspectives, if that makes sense. Because we often don't show or manifest emotion in the same way as non-autistic people, the implication had historically been that autistic people lack emotion. This is now clearly seen as ridiculous. Autistic people feel emotions just as keenly, often more keenly, than non-autistic people, just sometimes don't display those emotions in the same way as neurotypicals. Much of the early research that concluded autistic children lack theory of mind or lack empathy with others has subsequently been disproven, and many autistic kids have exceptionally well developed theory of mind, exceptional ability to understand others' perspectives, and are exceptionally, at times overwhelmingly, empathetic and emotional in response to others' feelings. Hearing all that thoroughly questioned and knocked down was quite gratifying, as I think it's a large part of where the stigma around autistic people, particularly from older non-autistic people who are fed this rubbish, can still remain and fester. What may happen that gave rise to some of this is that due to communication and processing differences, autistic people have to teach themselves empathy and understanding different points of view rather than it coming intuitively. But we can and do this. And this also made 100% sense to me. I remember in my teens and early 20s being told I only see things from my own perspective. And I remember that infuriating people because I could be stubborn and inflexible and maybe a bit judgy in my opinions. Now, people actively come to me for advice if they're struggling with someone they work with, for example, because I seem to be quite good, potentially better than others even, at understanding varying perspectives. So it chimes with me that these skills can be actively learned through close observation and ongoing reflection, even if they're skills that may become less intuitively than they do for others. Dr. Milton's increasingly recognised double empathy problem / double empathy theory, it goes some way to addressing what happens around this from a much needed autistic perspective. And the basics of it are, given that communication is a two-way street, maybe the communication problems go both ways too and shouldn't just be flagged as an autistic deficit in this regard. Non-autistic people find it just as hard to work out what autistic people are thinking as it is for autistic people to work out what non-autistic people are thinking, hence double empathy problem, not exclusively autistic empathy problem. There's just more of them than us. So communication difficulties have, until recently, been cast as exclusively our fault. Like, 3 friggin' cheers for that, man. And again, I'll include a link to a longer video in the description to this video where Dr. Milton explains the double empathy problem in more depth than I'm giving it here. Essentially, it's not a deficit on the part of the autistic individual, and it's not a deficit on the part of the non-autistic individual. It's just 2 types of brain that are fundamentally different in the way they experience the world. So of course there will be some difficulties in syncing up communication between the two. The course mentioned some really interesting research from Dr. Catherine Crompton showing that when autistic people communicate with each other, knowledge transfer is as intact as when non-autistic people communicate with each other. This is fascinating. And it's presumably why autistic or otherwise neurodivergent people tend to gravitate towards each other and often feel as if it's non-autistic people who are the weird ones in life. Non-autistic people, with all your weird hints and ambiguous doublespeak, are just as baffling and quirky to us as autistic people are to them. To us, we're the quote-unquote normal ones. And Dr. Milton goes further and believes non-autistic people actually struggle more to understand autistic people than vice versa, because autistic people spend most of their lives studying non-autistics, trying to work out what on earth's going on with them. So we tend to get quite good at it, whereas non-autistic people generally have zero motivation to try to understand autistic behaviour. So they don't. We just get branded enigmatic and hard to know. But the friendships and bonds we do form tend to be really strong because people have taken the time to actually connect in an authentic way, rather than just paying lip service to connecting at surface level. Non-autistic people, I think, can do both deep connections and surface level connections. But for autistic people, I think surface level connections are a real struggle, because it just feels like acting, which we have to do enough of anyway. It just feels wrong and inauthentic and transactional for many of us. It infuriates us how neurotypical people don't say what they mean. They tiptoe around things and hint at things and suggest things and talk around an issue, or being two-faced behind people's backs. It drives us up the wall. Just say what you mean. And having all this set out so clearly for me 5 months into my own awakening was just mind-blowingly useful and affirming that there was nothing wrong with me, and had been nothing wrong with me all along. It also explained why office politics and personality clashes in jobs I've had have absolutely driven me to despair in the past. They just don't compute. But being good at office politics and false flattery and social climbing is seen as a skill in many roles, and it's a skill set many of us don't have. You're often rewarded for deception and being two-faced and good at manipulating in the neurotypical world. Exhibit A, politics. It's a skill to talk out of both sides of your mouth. Not to us, it isn't. But then whenever you get a quote-unquote honest politician, people love them. More autistic people in politics and decision-making roles, please. Anyway, I digress. The course goes on extremely helpfully to ask, what is it like for an autistic person living in a predominantly non-autistic world, and uses the comparison of moving to a new country with a completely different culture, social norms and societal expectations. And this is what living in a non-autistic world feels like for an autistic person 24/7. You're constantly watching, observing, worrying that you're going to get something wrong or fuck something obvious up, trying to work out what people are thinking and what they mean by their behaviour. Some non-autistic people will say everybody feels out of their comfort zone and socially awkward sometimes. And the difference is, yes, sometimes everyone can feel out of their element in the everyday world. Autistic people broadly feel out of their element in the everyday world all the time. That's the difference. And for people who say everyone's a little bit on the spectrum, would you worry excessively about going into a new supermarket because you don't know the layout? Would you worry excessively about getting it wrong trying to buy a bus ticket? Would you worry excessively about asking where a toilet is, or ask for help in a shop, or telling a waiter they got the order wrong? Autistic people worry about everything all the time. So when often well-meaning non-autistic people tell us everyone's a little bit autistic and everyone's a little bit on the spectrum, it can be pretty grating, even though it's meant well. Autistic people understand how autistic people feel. Non-autistic people don't. Non-autistic people might be said to, how to put this delicately, lack empathy and understanding of autistic people's experiences. And George Watts, who wisely says, never trust anyone who claims to be an autism expert, because no one is an autism expert. We're all constantly learning, talks very relatably about studying autism in her 30s after working with adults with learning difficulties. And after about 18 months of studying autism, she had a penny drop moment and realised she was in fact autistic. She laughs at herself for it taking so long, but I can completely relate to what she says, because the popular impression of autistic people, either with high support needs or who are savant geniuses, generally does not match with the lived experiences or self-perception of most of us who are broadly pretty quote-unquote normal, all too often missed as being on the spectrum by ourselves, let alone wider society, and just suffering in silence and ignorance. But when the penny finally drops, suddenly everything that's gone before makes sense. And for a lot of us, as it did with George in the course, autism itself becomes a fascinating topic and something of a hyper focus for us. George talks about how 3 years previously she wouldn't have said she has any issues with social communication. She's fine, she has friends, she does things, she's nothing like the autistic people she studies. But 3 years on, she sees that being autistic has essentially coloured every action, everything she's ever done, said or thought. And new memories surface all the time for her when she thinks, that weird thing from 10 years ago, that was me being autistic. Again, just super relatable stuff, and so good to just watch the videos of people describing their own experiences and just feeling seen yourself, because more often than not, you've been thinking and feeling those exact same things. She describes constantly playing a social game that everyone else knows the rules to and that you're trying to guess. She uses an example of feeling stressed and anxious and just wanting to go home, but friends asking her for a coffee and her feeling obligated to say yes and go, and having to drink the biggest cup of coffee in the world and feeling unable at any point to say, I don't want this cup of coffee, I just want to go home. Forcing yourself through that social dance to not stand out or seem weird because you just don't know how to explain that you don't want to do the thing that people expect you to want to do. It's all just great stuff, and I'm not doing it justice recapping it. But that's what I've just described. That's textbook social masking. And like I mentioned before, it's not exclusive to women. Boys and men do this too, but it does seem to be way more common in autistic women. And to kind of confirm that, Dr. Milton explains how he never really worried about all that stuff and just kind of said what he thought directly, or did his own thing, or wandered off and didn't mind people thinking he was rude or aloof, and just tended to avoid unfamiliar situations he knew would make him anxious, like meeting new people or talking to strangers on the phone. As a result, he became very routine focused. These different approaches to differences are absolutely fascinating to me around this kind of dance of expectations. I can look back and see I did a bit of both, and I do remember friends as far back as school telling me I was really unpredictable and didn't really know what that meant. I think by the time I was a teen, I quite lent into it in a way and quite liked being seen to be unpredictable, maybe, even though I had no real understanding of why I was that way. Dr. Milton talks about developing strategies to deal with stressful situations, but the situations themselves never become less stressful, and I think that's key. As soon as you think you've worked out the rules of a social situation and conventions, they change and you feel like you're at sea again. It's very easy to become quite socially isolated as an autistic adult. Those stressful situations just grind you down after years of doing the same things, even when you think you're quote-unquote coping with them. Dr. Milton also rails against the medical model way of describing autistic people, which I touched on earlier, using language that may be appropriate in a diagnostic setting, like lacks flexibility, lacks theory of mind, rarely describes the totality of a real living person, and that can be quite dehumanizing. He describes having a conversation with a professional and banning them from using the words behavior, function, or independent while talking with them, and insisting they just use everyday language as if they were talking about a non-autistic person, and they struggled, and that was very telling. And I think that highlights the gulf that still remains in many ways between the way people in the research community talk about autism and the way autistic people talk about autism. That gulf, I think, is getting smaller, but it's still there. There's a bit about language and the way we describe autism. Autistic is fine, being autistic is fine, neurodivergent is fine, Aspie or Asperger's is complicated, see chapter 12. Having autism is broadly out. It's not an accessory that we carry about with us, it's part of who we are. But generally, live and let live with how autistic people want to self-describe is the gist of that. But it's about listening to autistic people and the autistic community rather than telling them and making assumptions. Again, this is just great stuff. And it's a great course, and I highly recommend that anyone, not just autistic people or parents, partners or carers of autistic people, but practitioners in the field of autism, healthcare workers, GPs, employers, basically everyone take this course and educate themselves about the range of autistic experiences. Anyway, I'll stop there for this week. I've already gone super long. I appreciate this week is basically a very long video of me essentially reviewing coursework. But taking this course was hugely significant for me, 5 months into my own self-discovery journey, so there was never a question of not including it in my video series as a significant part of my journey, getting to understand this part of me better. It's a 4 weeks long course, like I've said, and it really did dominate the information I was taking in at this point. And I'll probably talk even more about this course next week. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Do sign up for and take the online course. Again, links to the course and lots of other good stuff mentioned I'll put in the video description text. Please do subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and when you do, click to receive notifications in the drop down preferences of the subscribe button, so I can tell you whenever I put out a new video. Yeah. Oh, finally, can I just celebrate myself for a second, and can we take a moment to appreciate my grizzly beard? Anyone who's watched my chapter 15 video on trick will know growing a full beard without pulling half of it out is a pretty rare occurrence for me. This is what 3 weeks of not working and spending my days on things that actually interest me does for a boy's face. And I'm thoroughly enjoying it before it gets too itchy and I have to shave it off. Yeah, random end, but these are my thoughts. Have a good week and see you next Sunday. Cheers.